Welcome to the History of Psychology show. I'm your host, Christopher Green from York University in Toronto, Canada. The purpose of the show is to have conversations with prominent working historians of psychology about their research, their backstories, and their views of the field more broadly. For our fourth show, I am pleased to have a notable historian from beyond North America, Maarten Derksen from the Netherlands. Maarten is at the University of Groningen, where he has taught for the past 2 decades. If you're not familiar with Groningen, it is a lovely small city in the northeastern part of the country. The university there is more than 400 years old and is one of the top universities in all of Europe. Maarten works there in one of the few theory and history of psychology graduate programs in the world. He has published in an astonishing array of journals beyond those few that are most common for historians of psychology. He's published in Current Anthropology, History and Technology, Industrial and Organizational Psychology, Quarterly Journal of Speech, and the European Journal for Philosophy of Science, among others. In 2017, Maarten published a new book, Histories of Human Engineering, Tact, and Technology, which won the Book of the Year prize from Chiron. That's the International Society for the History of the Behavioral and Social Sciences. We're going to talk about the book and his background, of course, and about important differences between American and Dutch higher education in psychology. It will be a fascinating conversation. So, Maarten Derksen, welcome to the History of Psychology show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure is all mine.
So I'd like to start with the same questions I've been starting the previous interviews because of this extraordinary time. Tell me a bit about your experience of teaching during the age of the pandemic. Have you been teaching entirely online this term?
Not entirely. So we're in the second lockdown now. We had a lockdown in March, April. And then and we're having a lockdown now again. And at the moment, we can't teach, we can't lecture in the usual venues because everything's closed. So what we do at the moment is, online teaching, basically, talking to a webcam or recording stuff for. In between, we had what we called hybrid teaching. So I'd be in a lecture hall speaking to, say, 30 students who sat, 1.5 meters apart. And then the rest of the students would be home looking at the live stream of the lecture, or and this was the majority, they watched the recording afterwards whenever they felt like it. Do I like it? It has advantages and disadvantages. So I find it difficult to stay focused when I do online teaching. Basically you're speaking to a webcam, and if you have, some of our courses will have 300 students, and even if they don't all show up, there are too many students to fit on your screen, so you have no real contact with them. And I found myself, looking out the window and the sort of thing that you do at home. So that was difficult. One of the advantages I find is that, so I was teaching a philosophy of science course, and I had a chat window open at the same time. I found that students would chat amongst themselves. They would ask each other questions like, what on earth does this or that mean? Who was Popper again? And they'd start to answer each other's questions. And I had a student assistant who would notify me whenever he would keep an eye on the chat, and he would tell me, there's a question that they want an answer to, and then I would answer that question. And there was a lot more interaction, not just with me and the students, but also the students amongst themselves, right? Than usual, because normally in a lecture hall you don't want them to talk amongst themselves. You want them to, you need some quiet. So I like that. And it really gave me it gives you the feeling that people actually listening to what you're saying and they're
Right.
thinking about what you're saying. And so I enjoyed that. But yeah, just the technology is difficult. It puts a huge strain on the ICT infrastructure here. So we use Blackboard as a platform, and well, we've had occasions where Blackboard would just crash.
Yeah.
And since we also use it for most of our online exams, um, we've had a number of exams where halfway through the whole thing would crash, and of course, there would be huge panic among the students and all that kind of trouble.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I'm also chair of the examinations committee, the board of examiners for our program. And so it's up to me and my secretary to make a lot of difficult decisions, trying to solve problems that are not really solvable. So online examination is a nightmare because of these technical issues. For example, because what do you do when an exam has problems like that? Do they have to do another exam, or do you sort of take that into account in the grading, or things like that? We had to make decisions about. We get a lot of complaints about online exams, and not just from students, but also from the lecturers, of course. And there's there's quite a lot of well, we don't know how much, but there is some fraud going on.
Right. Do you think you'll continue to do any online teaching after we're no longer required? Are the advantages enough that you'd keep doing this, or do you think you want to go back to in classroom?
What I hope is that in general we'll take the good things that we discovered during the last half year, and because we've had to look at our teaching anew. So I think a number of courses have actually quite improved, just because lecturers, you can't do the same thing that you've been doing for the last 5 years. So you have to think, okay, so online, how am I going to do this? And I think a lot of courses have improved.
Sort of a forced refresh of everybody's syllabus.
Yeah. And also, so we took the decision that online multiple choice exams are not a good way of testing at the moment, just because it's too easy just to have your mobile phone open and use WhatsApp or whatever to exchange answers, and there have been cases of that. So we've said, okay, so you can't just do a multiple choice exam online. You need some sort of extra work for the students, assignments or that kind of thing. And I think that is actually an improvement.
I think a lot of people have done that.
Yeah. Because of course the standard form of teaching, unfortunately, is it's a number of lectures, and then an MC exam. And that's just not very interesting.
So let's talk about your book, Histories of Human Engineering. It was published by Cambridge in 2017, and it got the Chiron Book Award the following year. You start off by writing about philosophers from the ancient world, and a kind of millennia-old tension between, on the one hand, a drive to produce exceptionalist, law-like accounts of how speakers persuade their audiences, and on the other hand, the recognition that persuasion always occurs within a context. Who's the speaker's audience? What is the prior relationship of the speaker to them? What's the socio-political atmosphere under which the attempted persuasion takes place? That sort of thing. So there can never be hard laws of persuasion. So the so-called rules of persuasion, or rhetoric, can only ever be guidelines, always moderated by those other factors. Is that right?
Well, That is certainly a theme between these. On the one hand, you have this dream, as I call it, of yeah, some sort of system of persuasion that always works, right? That is effective, is efficient, and all you have to do is sort of plug in the contextual factors, and you know what you have to say, or you know how to manipulate or persuade your audience. That's the dream. Um, but on the other hand, you see throughout history this recognition that it is not that simple. In the end, I don't really take a stand on this. So I've thought about this a lot. Like, do I want to say that no, there can never be laws of persuasion? And in the end, I thought, well, this is a historical exercise. I'm not a philosopher. I don't really want to take a stand on this. Like, for example, social psychologist Michael Billig, he will say, no, you can't have laws of persuasion.
Right.
It's always contextual. You always have to adapt to an audience, and you can't have an algorithm. You can't calculate it. Um, and in the end, I decided I don't really want to take a stand on this. I want to see how I want to describe how psychologists and other social scientists have grappled with this rather
Right.
than take a stance.
So it's always dangerous to try and draw lessons from history. But while I was reading this chapter, I couldn't help but think about the current political situation, particularly in the US, where it
Mm.
seems that the polarization is so extreme, is so entrenched that no one is open to being persuaded by anyone else. That all attempts at persuasion seem to be met with suspicion
Yeah.
and stories about what the people's true underlying motives are. Do you
Mhm.
have some thoughts about that?
First of all, I think there is of course still a lot of rhetoric in play. Um, there may be a few efforts to sort of persuade the other side. But if you look at, well, Donald Trump, for example, um, rhetorically, he's quite effective. His style is completely weird, of course, but he does manage to, gather an enormous following. And it's immoral, but the very fact that he's managed to persuade his voters that the election has been stolen, and that I don't know, all these lies that he's been telling over the last 4 years. Um, Many of them lies that are so bizarre that you think no reasonable person could believe that. He's managed to convince, for the most part, relatively reasonable people that these were truths. So, in that sense, there's still a lot of rhetoric, but there is indeed, there does seem to be little dialogue between these two sides. And um, one factor might be, if I'm allowed to speculate, that the US is very much a two-party democracy. Um, and these parties have managed to divide the electorate between each other, right? Using means like gerrymandering. So there is perhaps little reason for them to actually connect to the other side, and to persuade these people. Um, the persuasion is always the rhetoric is aimed at those voters that haven't chosen yet, and that's such a minority that there isn't really an effort to persuade the hardcore base of Republicans or Democrats that they see things the wrong way.
Yeah, yeah.
That could be an explanation, but I must say that I thought about this question, and I find it very, very difficult to approach this subject from a symmetrical standpoint, as they say in science and technology studies. I find it very difficult not to take a stand here. And so, um, maybe my response is basically, well, if I were an American, I wouldn't want a dialogue with Trump and his followers either,
Right.
right? I find it very difficult to think about this without taking a stand.
Right. Which maybe is why we
Well,
do history, because we aren't as invested in some of the historical questions as in present
yeah,
questions.
yeah, and I've recently I've been working on more recent topics, and this is a problem that I do have, is that suddenly this sort of historical distance falls away, and you're already, if only because the people who read your work may be involved in the discussions that you're describing. Um, there's something comfortable about this historical distance that you have. And if you write about more recent topics, that you don't have that distance.
Right. So, in the chapter after the one on ancient philosophers, you leap forward to early industrial psychology, the early 20th century. People like Frederick Winslow Taylor and Lillian Gilbreth and Hugo Münsterberg and Walter Dill Scott. And you have an interesting take on this era, I think. The standard story, you say, and I think this is right, is that Taylor's scientific management was too mechanistic and inhumane, and that this failing was ameliorated by the intervention of psychologists such as Gilbreth and Scott and Münsterberg. But by contrast, you argue that Taylor's approach was not actually as ignorant of psychological factors as is often thought, and that the psychologists, far from making the mechanistic more humane, actually worked to subsume the human factor under the scientific one, the law-like and even the mechanistic. Could you expand
Yeah.
on that idea for us a bit?
Yes. So I think to start with, it's important to make a distinction between what Taylor wrote and said and how scientific management was put into practice. And of course, everybody who writes about Taylor and scientific management makes this distinction because in practice, of course, scientific management usually turned out different than what Taylor had said. So in practice, it wasn't a win-win situation as Taylor had promised, because in practice, the workers just had to work faster and didn't get more pay. Just one aspect of the difference between theory and practice in Taylor. But if you read what Taylor wrote about industry and about relations between workers and management, you do see interesting psychological ideas. Bearing in mind that, of course, Taylor wasn't a psychologist, he wasn't a scientist, so it's all very common sense like. But he did have a good eye for example, the dynamic behind soldiering. So for Taylor, soldiering was the big problem in 19th century American industry. Soldiering, where workers would work just as hard as they could get away with, but no harder. And we all reckon, if you've ever done, if you worked in industry, I've worked in a factory, and I know this. You don't work harder than you absolutely have to. And he realized how this worked because he'd worked in a factory himself, so he saw it firsthand. The other thing is, in Taylor's theory, at least, there's the core of scientific management, which is the sort of the system, which consists of breaking up work into separate tasks and assigning them to individuals, timing how fast this work could be done, and then connecting everything into a job and setting a piece rate. That's sort of the system, and it's entirely mechanical. It's mechanical in the sense that everybody has to do exactly what the plan says, including the management, by the way. So in scientific management, everybody is working for the system. Everybody is part of this mechanism. In practice, of course, that didn't work out like that, but that's the way it should have been. But outside this sort of core mechanism, Taylor described a sort of a social atmosphere that there had to be of collaboration. That there had to be this atmosphere of we're all in this together, and if we work together, if we collaborate, owners, managers, workers, then we can have higher production and higher wages, and everybody will be happy. And so this idea of we're all in this together has to be, that's the basis of the introduction of scientific management. If there isn't this realization that we're all that this is good for everybody and that we're working together, then you shouldn't introduce the system.
Right. And that collaboration didn't really happen in real life very much.
No, of course not. No.
So how did the intervention of the psychologist affect that?
Well, so psychologists said, and Münsterberg was perhaps the first to say that, although Lillian Moller-Gilbreths also saw this, that there are psychological aspects to the theory of scientific management, but in practice there isn't really very much attention to things like selection and training. And so, of course, these are things that Münsterberg and Moller-Gilbreths picked up. But if you look at how they saw these psychological aspects, then they're no less, perhaps mechanical is not the best word, but it's still the psychology that they wanted to apply here was still a psychology modeled on the natural sciences, right? A psychology that would discover law-like relations between variables and apply these in a practical context. So in that sense, the introduction or the growing role of psychologists in scientific management and in industry more general didn't really, at first at least, wasn't a break with that model, with that sort of, let's say, mechanistic model of human behavior. That came later.
So how do we describe this then? So the usual story is that they sort of humanize scientific management, but in fact, it seems that they extended the mechanism, if you like, of scientific management to the psychological aspects. Is that how it ended up playing out in the teens and 20s?
Certainly in the teens and early 20s. I think a very important shift came when management theorists started to look at how do you get people to do what you want them to do? How do you how do you give orders? Basically, that was a very important issue. And in scientific management, of course, this is simple. People just have to do what they're told.
Right.
Once people accept that that scientific management is to their benefit, once they have this sort of atmosphere of collaboration, then they will accept that they have to do what the manager says. In practice, that didn't work very well, and this, of course, is a very important theme in my book. Maybe the theme is that if you tell people what to do, then often they will resist that. There's always a problem of recalcitrance. And I think a very important change in management practices came when that resistance was taken into account in management styles.
Right. So management became partly a problem of how to persuade people to do things, how to draw out their cooperation rather than trigger their resistance.
Yeah. So in Taylor, in scientific management, you had a square deal, as he formulated it. So there is no deception. Everybody knows how the system works, and given this atmosphere of collaboration, then you just do what you're told, and there's completely transparent. Once you give orders in a way in which you take into account that resistance and try to be more subtle about it, then there's an element of deception is maybe too strong a word, but it's not as transparent as management for Taylor was.
Right. Well,
So one
tact
of
is a
the
word you use a lot. Tact
yeah,
is,
so it becomes tactful.
yeah.
So an example is rather than telling your employees this is what you have to do, you sit down with your employee and you say, okay, let's look at this situation together, and what do we have here, and how can we solve this? And then um, you let the employee find, diagnose the problem and find the solution, him or herself. Guided, of course, by the manager who knows what the solution is. But the idea is that you give the employee the feeling that they've come upon this solution themselves, and so they give their own order, basically.
This sounds remarkably like many university committees that I have sat on over the years.
Yeah, it is a very common technique. And in a later chapter where I speak of the work of Kurt Lewin and his students, you see exactly the same technique again, and they called it discovering the facts.
Yeah.
And again, it's you sit down with the people, and you say, okay, what do we have here? What is the problem here, and how can we solve this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So in the chapter after that one, after the one about scientific management, you write extensively about the origins of sociology, which I found really fascinating because sociology and psychology are right next to each other, but somehow the history of psychology, and I've been as guilty of this as anybody, almost never speaks of the history of sociology, which is happening right next door. And they're often working on similar or even the same problems, but just take the occasional swipe at each other rather than talking about what the guys down the hall are doing.
And they have a social psychology too.
That's right. There's a second social psychology, Ross's social psychology. But the parallels are quite striking. Just as psychology has had a constant internal debate about the relationship between doing sort of basic research on mind and behavior on the one hand and applied practice on the other hand, clinical psychology, for instance. So sociology has had a struggle between, on the one hand, discovering what they call basic laws of society and doing and applying those into some sort of form of social work, or as the early Chicago sociologists Albion Small and Charles Henderson called it, social technology. Could you talk about that term a bit?
Yeah. So this is perhaps the most difficult chapter for me in the book, partly because I'm not a sociologist, and so I had to familiarize myself with that whole history, but also because the history of these terms, technology and technique, is very, very complicated. So technology, nowadays we use the term technology mostly for for stuff, for machines, for devices, laptops, webcams, refrigerators. That's what we call technology. When the word technology was first introduced in somewhere in the 19th century, it meant the study of the practical applications of the natural sciences, basically. The ology of techne, basically.
Right.
And before that, machines and stuff like that were called the useful arts. And the useful arts was a very broad term. So cooking was a useful art too. That same Charles Henderson, early on, he wrote about the useful arts, and this was before he worked for Small. And there is a text in which poetry is also a useful art. So you get this term technology becomes popular. So late 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of people in social science and psychology, they start saying, okay, so we've had natural science and its technology. And of course, the 19th century had been, one long series of amazing inventions and innovations, and everybody was amazed by that. And so these people started saying, look, we have a science too, a social science or a psychology, and so we can have a technology too. Maybe not now, but very soon we can apply our knowledge for the good of mankind. It will be the mirror image, so to speak, of natural science and its technology. And so, for instance, Münsterberg, Hugo Münsterberg, he had the same symmetry that where he said psychotechnics stands to psychology as technology stands to natural science, or engineering stands to science, something like that. The same symmetry argument you see, for instance, in Gerard Heijmans, the Dutch pioneer of psychology, exactly the same argument. It was a way of selling psychology. Like we can be useful too, in exactly the same way that the natural sciences are useful. Very powerful argument, of course.
But the term social technology isn't the one that took off in the end. It was social engineering instead. There was this shift.
Yeah. So social technology was very popular for maybe 20 years. Albion Small, so the pioneer of Chicago sociology, the one who started the department, he came up with this term. And it meant, for him, it meant the study of the application of sociology. And this was a very important thing for him because on the one hand, he wanted sociology to be useful, but on the other hand, he didn't want sociology to be social work. So there's a very tricky demarcation going on there. So, for example, he didn't want his sociology to become like what was called social science in America in those years. And social science was more or less a movement that tried to chart all kinds of social facts. It was sort of empirical on a rather shallow way. And Small said, no, we need a real sociology that has theories about the mechanism underlying all these social facts. And then we can have a social technology that applies, that theorizes the application of these mechanisms, these theories, and the actual application has to be done by engineers, by social engineers, by social workers,
right.
Practical people. So he positioned social technology right in the middle between, on the one hand, the science of sociology, and on the other hand, the practical. And this spread very quickly over American sociology departments. But then the meaning of the term technology started to change, and there was simultaneously the rise of what has been termed the machine age, and in the machine age, the engineer was he was the hero of the moment, so to speak. Engineering became the popular term, and at the same time, the meaning of technology started to change from the study of practical applications to machines and devices.
Right.
And that meaning, machines and devices, didn't really fit with what Albion Small saw as the task of that sort of discipline.
Right, because the outcome of a social technology or even a social engineering is not going to be an object like a refrigerator or an iPhone,
No,
but is going to be a certain kind of organization of some aspect of society.
some kind of intervention, or yeah, an
Yeah.
institutional change, or a protocol or
Right.
whatever. Yeah.
But then social engineering begins to take on sort of dark connotations itself, as you know, with the
Yes.
rise of Stalinism and Nazism and
Yeah. So the whole idea that society is something that can be re-engineered, reformed top down um, by the technocrats, for example. The technocracy movement had a very rather brief moment, um, but people were more or less disappointed in technocracy. And yes, the communism and fascism, of course, were bad examples of that kind of large-scale social engineering. That's definitely not something that the Americans wanted.
hmm
Um, so yes, social engineering for a while was the more popular term, but towards the Second World War, it lost popularity. Became popular again in the 50s.
yeah. So, we could talk about the book all day. There's lots of interesting things in the chapters after that. You talk about all kinds of interesting people like Dale Carnegie and Kurt Lewin and Karl Popper and the brainwashing scare of the 1950s and its kind of
Mhm.
reemergence, more recently. But the
Yeah.
final chapter is about something that psychologists are laboring under the shadow of right now, the so-called replication crisis. The standard explanation, I guess, for the failure of many established effects to fail under replication is that researchers have been systematically engaging in a range of questionable research practices. They're often called that produce the appearance of a solid phenomenon. And that's in combination with journals refusing to publish studies in which no
Mhm.
effect is produced.
Yeah.
The
Because they're lies.
critics of these replications, these failed replications, often reply that with the argument that the effects are subtle and can be easily undermined by a wide range of hidden moderating variables. Now,
Yeah.
I've always found this to be a pretty weak argument because it seems to undermine the possibility of scientific psychology itself.
Mhm.
But you take the argument in a different direction, which I thought was interesting. First, by suggesting that what was really called into question by the replication crisis was not merely the skill or even some sort of semi-mystical talent on the part of the experimenter, but rather the appropriateness of the experimental enterprise itself
Yes.
in drawing out laws of human behavior. Now,
Yeah.
that's not an original criticism of psychology. We've
Oh,
heard
no,
it
no.
right back to the days of Wundt, I think.
Mhm.
But what I found interesting was in your next step, you argue that, and I'm going to quote you here: human behavior is historically and socially variable, but to a varying extent. The variability of psychological phenomena is itself conditional, not absolute. So, in
Mhm.
other words, our efforts to understand any given class of human behavior should allow for both the possibility that is lawful and the possibility that it is not. Could you
Yes.
expand on that a bit?
So even that is not a very original thought. A couple of weeks ago, I listened to an online presentation by Ken Gergen, and Ken Gergen is, of course, the pioneer of social constructionist psychology, and there's this famous paper of his from 74, I think, Social Psychology as History, which
Mhm.
basically says social behavior is always contextually variable, is historical, and there are no laws of social behavior. So we should approach social behavior in a different way. We shouldn't do experiments, or if you do experiments, then they're basically sort of
Like sort of
what's the
historical
word?
snapshots of
Yeah, yeah. So you can use them to sensitize people to certain patterns, but you shouldn't expect these patterns to hold. Um, And in this online presentation, Gergen said, "Well, I have this. I have proposed at times this. I think he called it the $1,000 challenge, and the challenge would be you have a participant in an experiment, and you promise them $1,000 if they can resist the manipulation." Right. So, say you have a participant in the Stroop test, for example. You give them $1,000 if they manage to resist the Stroop effect. And he presented this as one way of sort of differentiating between behavior that really is more or less lawful and behavior that is not lawful because you get these what he called enlightenment effects. Once you tell people about the pattern, then they can resist it, etc. My hope for the replication crisis is that not just that there will be methodological reform, because I think that's actually a rather minor issue, but that it will also force psychologists to look at these kinds of fundamental questions because experiments fail to replicate. And the more often your experiments in a certain field of study fail to replicate, the more you should wonder whether this is actually the right way to go about studying these phenomena. Should you really look for mechanisms here, or should you approach this particular form of behavior in a much more historical fashion?
Yeah, I think you said that you say at one point that the failure of the experiments has managed to grab the attention of psychologists in a way that centuries of philosophical arguments have failed to do.
Yeah, and I see some evidence for that attention. Not enough, because of course, the way psychologists work now, for many it works perfectly. You get publications, you get your output, you get promotion. It's a system that works.
For your career, but maybe not for knowledge.
Exactly, and my hope is that, and I do see some evidence for that, is that these repeated failures of replication, the philosophical arguments are easy to brush aside, but if a non-replication is on Twitter within a day after you have the results in, and everybody speaks about it, and it turns into a huge controversy. That is that's an embarrassment.
Right.
So maybe that will actually encourage psychologists to look at fundamentally different ways of going about their work.
Right. So in the next part of the conversation, I'd like to talk a bit about how you got to be this way.
Oh, I have no idea.
Where were you raised? Where are you from?
I'm from Leiden, which is a university town, oldest university in the Netherlands. We always like to repeat this. Where I was born in 1964. And I lived there for, I think, 27 years. So almost half my life. And then I moved to Groningen to do my PhD.
Were your family, was your family academically inclined? Were your parents academics? Or?
Yeah, so I'm a second generation academic. My father was a physicist who ended up working at a physiology department. The family legend is that the physiologist wanted to do real science, so they hired a physicist. He died when I was fairly young. My mother was a secretary when she met my father, and this was the early 50s, and so when they married, she had to quit her job. and she raised 4 children.
Wow. Are any of your siblings academics as well?
No, no.
No. So was university education always something that was going to happen for you, or was that sort of a decision that had to be made when you were 18 or 19 or whatever?
No, I think no. It was clear quite early on that I was going to university,
Yeah.
and everybody said this. Oh, you'll go to university.
Right.
And I think one of the last things my father said to me was that you'll be an academic.
Really.
So this was always clear. I didn't always want to study psychology, but that I was going to university was
Right.
was a given, more or less.
So you did a bachelor's and a master's at Leiden, and your master's thesis was on dream interpretation. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So I had a psychoanalytic period as a student. My supervisor, my mentor, more or less those years, he was interested in Wittgenstein and in psychoanalysis, and so
That's quite a combination.
I,
I think Wittgenstein has some things to say about psychoanalysis.
he has said several things. He has some remarks about psychoanalysis, I think, and there are a couple of remarks about dreams in the philosophical investigations.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's.
You don't want to tell us any more about that thesis? Is that part of
Oh,
your
the thesis. So no, I still think it's a funny thesis. So basically, the problem I started with is okay. So you have a dream, and if you want to interpret a dream, you need a dream report. Yes.
Yes.
So what happens in dream interpretation, for instance, in psychoanalysis, is that the client will tell a dream. So that's the dream report. And the problem seemed to me to be that how do you know that this dream report is actually a faithful representation of the dream itself? Because we all know how hard it is to remember your dreams.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, and secondly, I may, as a waking person, I may have noticed things in my dream, but who tells me that these are the relevant things, the significant things in my dream? If you assume that the dream is a product of the unconscious and the dream work, of course, then it doesn't. It's not self-evident that the things that you notice as a waking person are actually the most meaningful things. Well, so that's the problem I started with, and then I tried to solve this using the hermeneutical theory of Hans-Georg Gadamer, which was another thing that my supervisor was interested in. Talking about it now, I realize how much I was, a pupil,
Yeah.
a follower of my
Yeah.
everything I did. It was basically.
So you go from Leiden to do doctoral work in Groningen. Did you come there for the theory and history of psychology program that you're in now, or did you go there for
Yes.
other reasons?
I went there because they had a position for a PhD student. Academia in the Netherlands is different in a number of ways from how it works in North America. And some of these differences are hard to see because, for instance, we use the terms bachelor and master nowadays, but the bachelor and master system in the Netherlands is not quite the same as it is in North America. And our mutual friend Jeremy Berman can tell you lots of stories about these kinds of differences because he keeps stubbing his toes against these differences. So in the Netherlands, at least in those days, PhD students, as a PhD student, you had a salaried job for 4 years. and a position came free. So I applied, basically.
Right. And so you have to finish right within those 4 years. There's no lingering around, for 6 and 7.
Well, you can linger if you want. So it took me a bit longer because well, there's illness and other things. So it took me, I think, 6 years in the end.
Yeah.
But of course, the last 2 years I had no income from
Right.
the university.
I see. And so what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on the demarcation of psychology from common sense, and it was about the rhetoric of demarcating psychology from common sense. Rhetoric, again, was another interest of my mentor in Leiden. It's amazing how much my career has been shaped by this man.
So
Um,
did you have formal training in rhetoric at some point, or was that just something you picked
no,
up because you needed it?
I just picked it up. This is another thread that goes through my career. I'm a terrible dilettante, and I'll familiarize myself a bit with things that I'm interested in, and then I'll write a paper or a book,
Yeah.
and then I turn to something else. I think this is something that all historians and sociologists of science do.
Yeah.
You know,
I
this
think
is
that's right.
one of our skills. But of course, it has you always run the risk of not quite learning enough of a particular topic to really convince the experts in that topic.
Yeah.
Um,
So
anyway, so yeah, the thesis was about, so if you're a psychologist and you want to persuade, you want to convince lay people that what they think about human behavior is not scientific and not correct, then you have the rhetorical problem that you have to use knowledge that they don't have, right? So if you want to convince people that they don't have the right knowledge, somehow you need some basis to for your persuasion. You need a common ground, right? You can't just say, well, here's my theory and here's the statistics,
right.
because they don't understand the theory and they don't understand the statistics. So you need some sort of common ground, a locus communis, as it's called in rhetorical theory, a commonplace. And the commonplace that I saw in many of their efforts, I focused on Dutch psychologists, and the commonplace that I found in much of their efforts was the idea that we are all psychologists.
Mm-hmm.
That what people do in daily life is a form of psychology,
Right.
right? We try to understand each other, we try to predict each other's behavior, we have theories about each other's behavior, we have these maxims or rules of thumb, and what psychologists did was to say, okay, so that's a common sense everyday form of psychology.
Yeah.
But by the very fact that it's not scientific, it's not good, because of course psychology is a science, right? So if you want to do psychology, then you should do it the right way, and we are the experts on psychology. That was more or less the kind of argument that you see a lot, and this idea that we're all psychologists, but very flawed psychologists, I think is still one of the themes in social psychology. So a lot of social psychology, a lot of decision theory and that sort of thing is about all these mistakes that everyday psychologists make in their dealings with other people.
Right, which is how you get these sort of novel and surprising findings, sort of counterintuitive findings that kind of dominate the literature.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So after you finished your dissertation, you went to Bath for a couple of years. You took a couple of years off, and you went to Bath in England.
Well, this was because I had a postdoc at the time, but I was also married with Anne Beaulieu, and she got a job at the psychology department at University of Bath in England. And of course, I went with her. And when after half a year, our son was born. That's 20 years ago this year. And I just finished my postdoc, and so I became a full-time father for a couple of years.
Right. But you worked with, you published with people like Graham Richards, and did you work with him and some other?
I don't think I ever published with, no, I never published with Graham. I knew him, of course, and I think I'm in an edited volume
That must be what I'm
with
thinking of.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you find that the shift from Dutch psychology or Dutch theoretical psychology to English history of psychology was there a big separation there? Were there very big differences, or did you
No,
find?
no, because we in Groningen had contacts with people like Graham Richards and Roger Smith. What was, of course, a bit of a shock, maybe even, was just the way that universities work in Britain. British academics have to work really, really hard
Yeah.
for rather little pay.
Yeah.
You know, up until the level of, I think, lecturer, it's a hard existence.
Right.
And that was a bit of a shock for us.
Right. So you came back to
So
Groningen as a faculty member after that.
yeah, so after 2 years, my wife more or less had enough of it, because we really had to, you know, we each had £100 of pocket money every month. So we were sick of that. And she could get a position in Amsterdam. And so we moved back. And then a year later, the position I currently have came available. And I applied, so I started working home.
Yeah. So, judging by the publications you've written, your range of interests over the years has been quite wide. How would you characterize them? Is there a thread? You've mentioned rhetoric as one thread. Is there a thread that holds them together in your mind, or are your different projects sort of opportunistic? You take on topics as you find them.
Well, as I just said, I'm a bit of a dilettante, and I have a wide variety of interests. I do think there are one or two threads running through all my work, and one of them is that issue of, is psychology a science like other sciences such as physics or biology, or what is the relation between psychology and other sciences? And so my thesis about psychology and common sense was partly also about that. Is you know, psychologists in demarcating themselves from common sense were trying to say, look, we're a real science.
Yeah.
And of course, for a social constructionist like Gergen, that demarcation is, you know, there's no demarcation basically. It's, or at least the relation with lay people is completely different.
Right.
So that is one theme. And I think that the theme of control and resistance, that is central to my book. That is another theme that runs through my work.
Yeah. I take it that your answer to the question, is psychology a science like physics and biology, is no. Or is it more complicated than that?
It's always more complicated. So on the one hand, I do think there are aspects of psychology. Psychology is a remarkably diverse field. You've written about this yourself. You know, it's a rather bizarre collection of subfields, and it's not entirely clear what holds them together. I think in my department, I think one of the things that holds it together is that people don't discuss too much with each other. Sort of let each other, you know, you do your work, I do mine.
Oh, is that so?
I wouldn't be surprised if that was an important factor and this is of course often the case. I mean, in social interaction, you know, to some extent you you keep everything together by not being too explicit about your own standpoints, and
This is true.
if we always said exactly what we thought, then we wouldn't have a good life together.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how important non-intellectual factors are in keeping psychology together, that it's
That's
very
true.
difficult to begin new departments. It costs a lot of money, and you need new
Yeah.
space and new department heads and new secretaries, and universities are mostly loath to spend that kind of money unless it's absolutely necessary. So as long as the incredible diversity of people who call themselves psychologists can get along with each other by using the kind of tact you're talking about, by not talking too explicitly about what they're doing, universities are perfectly happy to keep psychology as a discipline, even if it's really 3 or 4 different disciplines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I do think that there are subfields of psychology that look into phenomena that are more or less lawful, and where the experimental method and statistics and the whole quantitative apparatus is quite suitable for. And then there are subfields of psychology where I think, at the moment at least, it doesn't really work very well. And so, again, I think in those fields, it would be good if there were a more fundamental reflection on, what are we doing here, and is this the best way to look at these topics and phenomena?
Yeah. Before we go, I'd like to talk a bit about the differences between American and Dutch education, higher education.
Yeah.
Like you said, the Europeans are now using the word bachelor's and master's, but it doesn't mean quite the same thing as it does in North America. How long does a bachelor's degree take in the Netherlands?
3 years.
It's 3 years instead of, in North America, it's mostly 4.
Yeah.
Here in Ontario, it was 3 for a while because we had a 13th grade in high school, but they eliminated that a decade or so ago. And so we
Okay.
assimilated to the American system of 4 years. And how much in tuition do Dutch students typically pay as undergraduates?
As undergraduate, again, is a term that is very confusing
When doing bachelor's
for
degrees?
doing a bachelor degree. So a Dutch student or a student from the EU would pay a little over 2,000 euros, if I'm not mistaken,
2,000 euros a year.
a year. And then, and that's tuition, right? So we don't have, or most of the universities don't have a campus. So it's just tuition. You still need to find yourself a place to live and
Right.
that sort of thing.
Right. So, and the euro is worth a little bit more than the US dollar now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Like $1.10 or $1.20, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Right. So in the US right now, there's a huge amount of emphasis on completion rates because so many students are unable to, partly because of the tuition, the high tuition, many students are unable to finish the 4 years or they leave for other reasons. Is that an issue in Dutch university?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There was this whole thing about the, I don't know what the word in English is, but about the more or less the efficiency of our education. And at some point, the Minister of Education said, okay, I want all these bachelor programs to have a sort of an 80% efficiency. So 80% of the students who come in the first year have to get their bachelor in 3 years' time.
Right.
And I think we're at that level now, and we had to be.
And so how was that accomplished? I mean, they always say they want to do that without watering down the rigor of the programs, but obviously watering down the rigors of the programs is the easiest way to accomplish that. Is
one way was to make the first year selective. So what we did in psychology is we moved a couple of the statistics courses. We have quite we are a statistics heavy program. And it was a conscious decision to move a couple of the statistics courses to the first year and early on in the first year, so that the students who couldn't passed their statistics exams could move to a different program in February, and then they wouldn't lose any tuition. Like financially, this is a good moment to switch studies. Um, and a second thing is that there's what is called a binding study advice,
Hmm.
which is a rather paradoxical term, of course. And it means that if you don't get, I think at the moment is 45 of the 60 credits of the first year, then you are bindingly advised to find a new study, to go to another program.
I see.
And so by making the first year selective in this way, um, once you're through that, then you're supposed to be able to make it to the end.
Right. And so
Um,
does that make shifting? I mean, often people come into university and they don't really know what they want to study, or they
yeah,
think they want to study something and they find out they don't like the work, even if they like the topic. Is
yeah.
it difficult to shift around, change majors, as we'd say in North America, or
So if you do that in your first year, if you
yeah,
do it before February, then that's no problem.
right.
Then it's fairly easy. Another thing we try to do in our department is we try to have selection before people start their studies, right? So for a couple of years, we had a sort of a selection procedure where students would be asked to follow a few lectures and do a simple exam. And then if they didn't get a good grade on the exam, again, they were advised, you can study with us, but keep in mind that this is the kind of thing that you have to do in your first year,
Right.
and you didn't do very well on this test, so maybe.
Right.
Um,
Give them a little bit of a taste of what the work is going to be like without them having to take a whole course or
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and this worked pretty well.
So you go from a 3-year bachelor's degree to a master's degree in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
How long are those? Are they 1 or 2 years? And how many of your students continue on? Is that something that's fairly normal for people to do, or is that
Yeah,
extreme?
just about all students do a master,
Yeah.
because if you just have a bachelor, that is not really taken seriously as as a university education.
Right.
And here the problem is that we call this a bachelor master system, and it has some of the characteristics of the North American bachelor master system, but it's sort of a replacement of an earlier system that was also a 4-year study
Right.
that had sort of the same structure, where the first 2.5 years were sort of general formation, and then a year and a half specialization. So
Right.
you still see the old system in the new bachelor master
There's
system.
a
So
shadow of it still remains.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the basic master is 1 year. So in our department we have 7 or 8 masters. One of them being a theory in history of psychology, right? Our master. And then the faculty has a research master in which the psychology program participates, and that's a 2-year master.
So for most students, they end up taking 4 years of university education, much like they do in the U.S. Except the last year sounds like it's more like what Americans would think of as graduate school. It involves research and working with a particular supervisor and writing a
Mm,
thesis
yeah,
and those sorts of
yeah,
things.
yeah. Ideally, the last half year of your master, you're working on your thesis, and you're being supervised relatively closely by a staff member.
Right.
We have a few master tracks that have so many students that the supervision is not always ideal. But like in theory and history, we're a small program, and each of us has like two or maybe 3 students writing a master's thesis under more or less intense supervision.
And what about theoretical and historical training in psychology? Obviously, at your school, there's a whole area in it, and people are getting training in it. Is that more common in Dutch psychology or European psychology generally, or is that something that's particular to your school?
Well, so it used to be a lot more common in the Netherlands than it is now. When I studied in Leiden, we were called theoretical psychology. Shortly after I left, it was abolished. And there were more groups like this, groups of psychologists in departments with a strong philosophical, historical interest, often with an interest in social reform as well, right? And all these groups have disappeared. So there are individuals here and there with historical interests, but we are currently the only group of theoretical historical psychologists in the Netherlands, and we're doing well. It's and we try to use this unique status in our advantage. It's always an argument like, we're unique. You can't do away with us. We make, we're distinctive, etc. It's a good selling point. Let's put it like that.
I think we say the same thing at York often.
Yeah, and if it works, go with it. Yeah. You can turn the argument around, of course. Also, if it's just you, then it can't be that important. Yeah. But at the moment, they like us. So.
Thank you very much for this. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for spending your time with us. You're welcome.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
So that's all for our 4th episode of the History of Psychology show. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank Maarten Derksen for spending time with us. I hope you come back for our next show, which will be an interview with my York colleague, Thomas Teo. That's all for now from the History of Psychology show.